Welcome to the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the city bar.
Hello, and welcome to this New York City Bar Association podcast. My name is Carl Hahn. I'm a partner at Steptoe LLP, where I focus on the intersection of artificial intelligence, emerging technology, and compliance. And I'm delighted to be the host and moderator of today's session, where we will talk about synthetic employees and the future of work. I'm going to be joined by a fabulous and expert panel that I will introduce here in just a minute. But first, I wanted to give a huge thank you to the co-chairs of the Presidential Task Force on Artificial Intelligence and Digital Technologies of the Bar Association, and to the co-chairs of that task force, Jerome Walker, Lorraine McGowan, and Tiffany Smith. The task force has been a tremendous leader in advancing the dialogue around the very issues regarding artificial intelligence that we are going to discuss today, and it's deeply appreciated. I also wanted to thank Tiffany Archer and Patrick Hentz, who are the co-chairs of the Subcommittee on Behavioral Science and Digital Technologies, for their leadership and support, without which we would not be having this podcast today. So with that, I'm going to jump in and introduce our panel, who are absolute rock stars in their respective fields, and I'm sure will deliver tremendous insights to you, our listeners. And let me start with Marcia Narine Weldon, who joins us from Florida. Marcia brings to us a widely varied and impressive background. She's been a law professor at the University of Miami, where she has researched, written, taught, and spoken globally on responsible artificial intelligence and the future of work. Marcia is the founder and CEO of Illuminating Wisdom, where she focuses on professional and personal development in an artificial intelligence-driven world. Marcia is also a recognized legal domain expert and has delivered training on artificial intelligence across the country for global tech companies. Finally, Marcia served as the former Deputy General Counsel, Chief Compliance Officer, Chief Privacy Officer, and Division Head of HR for Ryder, the well-known logistics company. I'm also delighted to welcome my good friend, Geoffrey Schaefer, who's the Vice President of AI Strategy and Governance at Leidos. We've known each other for several years as we've worked on responsible AI and governance. And frankly, Jeff and I serve on the board of trustees of the Washington Center here in DC, which is focused very much on the future of work and entry-level positions and jobs and how they're going to be impacted by the AI economy and what that means for education. He was named, and I didn't actually know this, Jeff, but this is awesome, as one of the top AI executives to watch in 2025 by Washington Exec, a well-known group here in the area. He's spoken widely about AI strategy and governance at the University of Cambridge in the UK, UVA, my alma mater, and you can find him on podcasts at the Carnegie Council, and his work has been featured in many leading publications that have to do with artificial intelligence. Prior experience was, and this is how I got to know Jeff, when he was the head of responsible AI at Booz Allen, and he has an intelligence and enforcement law background. So welcome, Jeff. This is going to be great. Last, but absolutely not least, and joining us kind of early from the West Coast is none other than Ramsey Brown, who, Jeff and Ramsey are not lawyers, yet they so kindly showed up here for the New York City Bar Association podcast. Ramsey is a neuroscientist and technology executive, known him for several years, absolute leader in the areas of AI, emerging technology, and governance. But I think for purposes of today's call, Ramsey actually builds the tech and deploys the tech. And then we talk about what we do with the tech. So he works where emerging technologies and critical challenges intersect. He builds companies and technologies alike. His expertise is focused on synthetic workers. That's the agentic agents we're going to be talking about today. AI autonomy, machine-to-machine economics, AI safety, AI and industrial policy, digital therapeutics, immersive reality, behavioral engineering, brain mapping, ocean desalination, I love this, and theoretical nanochemistry. Ramsey, of course, has lots of free time. He has done a lot of work across the economy. And as I like to tell people, this technology capability that we're talking about is being deployed now, and it's being deployed in the U.S. government and other sectors. This is not science fiction. So this is one reason we're having this podcast today. So with the intros out of the way, we need to jump into the content. And so what I wanted to start off with, and Ramsey, you can go first here, I think when we did our prep session, the first question is, so what is it, right? What are we talking about? because I was teaching a class yesterday at the Navy War College, actually, which is a really cool place, to an audience of pilots and military doctors and a fellow who's going to be the commander of a nuclear submarine. There's a low stress job. And I was talking about AI and agentic agents and all the rest of it, playing the whole your video, Ramsey, about the swarm. And it was obvious people were still confused because our conversation kept collapsing from, oh, we're talking about agents, but then we were all of a sudden talking about chatbots and ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity. I'm like, similar, but not quite. Not quite. That's not really what we're talking about. So you had this cool concept when we were prepping about the continuum of kind of what we're looking at with agents. And so why don't you step our audience through that so we can have a little bit of framing as to what we're talking about today.
Absolutely. And Carl, thank you for having us. Of course, it's a joy to be here with Marcia, Jeff, and yourself. So there's two things that I want to offer. First, we'll cover the spectrum because that's where I think all of the confusion lies right now. And admittedly, I'm sitting in the financial district of San Francisco in our offices, where admittedly we're half the problem here because every other billboard in San Francisco is for something about agents. And then I want to talk about the helpful mental model that I think people should have for what's actually going on. So the continuum is easy. Right now, it turns out you can get away with just about calling anything an AI an agent. Because admittedly, if you needed to go raise some venture capital and you called your still kind of mediocre chat system an agent, suddenly they'll give you $20 million. So this is mostly a marketing and branding problem. But that's not helpful. What's helpful to think about is there is a continuum of how much free, intrinsically motivated autonomy or self-directed open-endedness of actual behavior and action taking an AI system can have. And on one end that I think everybody's used to from the ChatGPT world is a chatbot. It is waiting for me. I type something in, it types something back. That's it. That's the whole name of the game. Very low autonomy, non-open-ended. You wouldn't say it's really executing any sort of complex behavior. And then you can kind of march down that line in this continuum of, all right, so maybe it uses a PDF that I gave it. Okay, maybe I've predefined that it can access a handful of our internal record keeping systems to go pull arbitrarily that which it thinks is important. That's actually a little bit of action it's going and taking. Well, maybe I've given it permission to not just pull that data, but push new data into that case record system. All right, now it's having to decide about what it should do, not just what it should respond to you and say. And that's where we start getting into what most people are really thinking about when they say agent territory. And we get this word of agent from this concept of agency, of performing actions, of having something like, and I'm going to make an incredible mistake of saying this word out loud on a legal podcast, but almost something like a notion of a loci of control or agency or accountability within a system to say, yep, it was the one that called the shot to do the thing. And then you keep marching down that pathway where now you're looking at the end of it, what we've invented with synthetic labor and synthetic work. You have an AI system that has an email address it can respond to, maybe names or preferred pronouns, its own laptop that it can run to control software using a mouse and keyboard, a persistent sense of self and an identity. And you have something that's shaped much more like a colleague than shaped like a tool. And that whole continuum people call agents. Obviously, our interest in synthetic labor is at the deep end of that because we think that's the most important thing we could get right. And that gets me to the second thing I want to give people is I think there's an awful lot of folks who aren't in AI and are looking at this, rolling their eyes like they're looking at Beanie Babies or like the early internet, like CD-ROMs and being like, oh, another one of these. I'll just wait it out. It'll go away. It's not that big of a deal. And there's lots of reasons why we want to need that to be true at times, because we once dreamed of poets and then they took the poet jobs because we read somewhere that it uses a lot of water every time you use it, runs up against our notions of truth and beauty. And they needed to be a calculator. They needed to be a glorified calculator. What I'm going to propose to them instead is the opposite. In the 20th century, the single invention that probably got us to modernity as it exists was not the telephone or the internal combustion engine or the atomic bomb or the internet, but the process of turning thin air into food. And the Haber-Bosch reaction and the Haber-Bosch process of turning air and the nitrogen in air combined with a little bit of hydrogen and some heat and pressure, turning that into ammonia which you turn into fertilizer, which you turn into food, became the single invention that got us to the modern condition. That because the rate limiter of carrying capacity of Earth was not real estate or sunshine or arable land. It was just ammonia. It was just fertilizer. And we found a way to turn raw resource into people, into population, into productive capacity. The right way to look at what AI is doing is the market has found a way to build a machine that turns electricity into productive capacity of the mind. Where the 20th century story might have been turning air into food and then energy into productive capacity of muscle, we've figured out how to do the Haber-Bosch process with knowledge work. And when we frame AI through that lens, it is hard to misunderstand the potential economic and societal impact of what it means to have a industrial scale synthesis of the faculty of people. And I would love people to have that mental model, because that one lets you make better predictions. That one helps you understand why everybody's losing their mind about AI constantly, or no one's shut up about it in the past 2 years. Because we're not staring down the barrel of Beanie Babies or CD-ROMs. We're actually staring down the barrel of the Haber-Bosch process, but for work, for all of the things that we spend time to go to college, learn to do the trade, set up a governance system. It's that. So that's, so I can give people that definition to be more useful.
Wow, that's amazing. And I love this electricity into productive capacity of the mind. That's what I'm gonna keep. I've been thinking about this and invite the rest of the group to jump in. As it's like the transition from steam to electricity, right? It's like you had one kind of energy, now you have a completely different kind of energy, and it's transforming everything. But I have to say, and maybe we can dialogue about this until we get into sort of like the how do you deploy it and how do you govern it, a little bit around how do we sort of climb the education curve here? Because what you just said, Ramsey, I mean, I literally just took a group of really high-powered, super skilled students at Navy War College students. They know what they're doing. They work with AI. They were all talking about AI. I'll just pause for a second. 2 years ago, I talked about AI. Nobody else in the room was talking about AI. Yesterday, every single research graduate student, their papers involved AI. Every one of them. I'm like, it's amazing. So that you can see people are really trying to grapple with this issue, but they're having a hard time with what you just said. To sit up there and even show them the little simple email that your sent me, forwarding the link to your white paper, which you just thought was so obvious. They're all just like, wow, that's amazing. I'm like, yeah, I thought he'd hired a new employee, but it's really not. It's just sent with an email and a name. Her name is Madeline, and Madeline sent me a paper and a link like any normal human would do. This is like a super simple example, but you can scale that, issue purchase orders, go online and do research and prove that you're human through that chapter, go on an LLM and submit your own search request and report back. Do anything you can possibly think of. So with that, Jeff and Marcia, I don't know if you have anything to add here as we sort of deal with sort of framing the definitional struggle, but also getting people to really understand what we're facing.
I think, Carl, first of all, thanks for having us. I want to jump in because I am distracted because Ramsey kept saying CD-ROM, and all I can think about is Encarta 94 and how good life was back then when they were coming in the mail. But I think a slightly more serious point, I think we should expect the reaction and the kind of mindset that you just described for a while. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. The first is this technology is still borderline science fiction, and it's also fantastical. So if you imagine being in the room and playing your teacher's role yesterday and thinking about who was there, I'm sure a healthy percentage of those leaders in the military are still amazed when they see an autonomous drone, an autonomous vessel, an autonomous aircraft of any sort. And that's for many good reasons. That technology is amazing. But it is a little bit fantastical still. But when we think about synthetic workers, if we think about agents, highly autonomous agents, these are also fantastical, but in a different way because they're so human to us. When we look at autonomous agents reasoning, communicating with us in very human-like ways, being able to take on work that we would normally do independently and get that across the finish line to a set of outcomes that our own bosses would recognize as being valuable and even normal. If you step back for even half a second, the only word that I can ever come up with to describe that is fantastical. It shouldn't be possible. But the technology is advancing so rapidly such that for some of these organizations, particularly the ones that Ramsey's working with his technology, that is happening right now. And yes, the technology still has a long maturity curve to climb, but we're already seeing real world value, tangible outputs, tangible ways of engaging with these systems that now present a really fundamental question that we all must contend with in our organizations. How do we design the next set of hybrid workforces? Not folks that have returned to office versus remote workers, but working alongside of humans and machines in a sort of symbiotic way, where in many cases we can't and maybe don't even want to tell the difference between our machine colleagues and our human colleagues.
And I'll add in, when you all talk about science fiction and fantastical, I mean, I guess it was 2020, what's been 2023. So I was doing a keynote in Lisbon. Microsoft had a thing called Building the Future, right? They had thousands of people in there, scientists, all kinds of people. And I started talking about, they asked me to talk about human rights and technology. And I was talking about generative AI and what it could do. And when I got off the stage, this is, by the way, 2 days after they announced their $10 billion investment in OpenAI, they didn't ask to see my slides. So it is what it is, right? But I was talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly that could come. And when I got off the stage, so many people were saying, that's what you're talking about. That's 10 years away. And these are some of the people who are involved in building things. I think the problem is, and for the lawyers who aren't steeped in looking at this stuff hours a day, like those of us on the podcast, I think things are moving much more quickly than even the people who are creating the technology would have expected, which is why you see the CEO of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, coming out a few months ago and then coming out again a few days ago saying, people need to be warned about this technology and the potential impact it will have on jobs. And I think of it from the governance lens and the employment law lens, right? When we think of, for example, employment law, and we're thinking of synthetic workers, what are these? Are they workers? Are they tools? Are they coworkers? Are they managers? For those who advise companies, if you think about the employment law ramifications, I used to tell my clients, hey, be careful. Once you hit 15 employees, then you got to comply with all these laws. What happens when the companies start to replace human beings with synthetic workers, but we don't know how to count them? This actually could mean that the thresholds could change. You're firing some people, so those people are no longer entitled to certain protections. But are the agents entitled to protections? So all of these different things are things a synthetic worker harass a human worker, or vice versa. So there's a lot of things we're going to get into, but the time is now. This is not science fiction. I was in a room full of people, including some government officials, and they said, what should we do? I said, I spend 50% of my time and money on trying to figure out how to use AI for good to solve all the problems you have in the world. I spend all that money hiring away all the best people. Basically, if they had done that before, we wouldn't likely be facing some of the issues we're facing now, where you have some of the big tech companies giving out professional athlete level salaries to look at some of these issues. So I think for the lawyers, the time is now. It isn't science fiction. And we have to think about how every area of law changes when we have synthetic workers in the workplace. How do we even define them? What laws protect them? And what laws do we need to maybe protect us? Those are some of the things that I think we need to talk about.
Yeah, I agree. And Marcia, I think thank you so much for teeing up the legal issues and frankly, the internal, and Jeff, you touched on this, the internal governance and organizational structure issues, they really start to come together. And I really think I think the capability has accelerated. It's amazing. In early 23, people were telling you that it was still going to take 10 years. I mean, because that's when, at least corporate America, from my perspective, kind of woke up to the reality of the AI revolution. And many of us wound up in boardrooms over that summer or that spring and summer of 23.
Well, this is
so
January
what's the AI
23,
strategy,
so
team?
this is January 23.
Yeah, January 23. So like within months,
Yeah.
It's like, what's our AI strategy? How are we doing this? The FOMO, fear of missing out, really started to build. And right now, I think we are like a FOMO, like 10x, right? Like exponential FOMO. And I think if you're a lawyer out there, or you're in a control function, or you're in an AI strategy job like Jeff, the capability that Ramsey's company can deploy is being deployed. It is being acquired. It is being done. It's either being done by your own organization or it's being done by the other problem we've talked about, which is shadow AI, which is you think people aren't using AI, but they're totally using AI. In fact, they may have already created an agent, their own digital twin. Why not? You can do that. I have a complicated life. I need a digital twin. They can go off and do my banking and my travel arrangements. And by the way, send emails to my boss. This is like the two full-time job problem that came up in COVID, except now the other full-time worker is digital, right? So it is literally happening. So the thing I wanted to pivot to, and I don't know if you want to try and lead us off here, Jeff, is really, it's a little bit of the what do we do about it problem, right? Because law and regulation, I mean, I'm not telling anybody on this call something they don't know already, is all over the place. You have an EU AI Act, which is the EU, which is still not fully implemented and now maybe stalling because of the whole competition issue. You have what's being done in China, and you have the patchwork approach in the States. You're not really going to have a comprehensive federal approach. You've got the New York City ordinance on interviews. So you have local law 144, you have Connecticut, you have Colorado, you have California, you have this patchwork. So to me, it's really not going to be about that. It's really about how are you managing your internal organizations? How are you managing your contracts with suppliers? How are you dealing with fundamental management obligations and fiduciary duties at your board level if you're publicly traded under Caremark to manage compliance? And Jeff, I think when we were prepping, you used the words AI governance 2.0, right? So, or maybe it's like 5.0 right now. So how can we, so this audience is going to be like, A, I'm trying to get my head around the fact that this capability is here. B, I've got this sinking feeling like there's this enormous risk thing that I don't really understand and I'm going to have no choice but to deal with, even though I'd rather be in denial and just say it's hype and hope it goes away, which it's not. So C, practically, how can we start to think about framing this and channeling this in a way that you can talk to a CEO, a GC, an audit committee, or other stakeholders?
It's an awesome question. And my first reaction is before you can figure out the best ways to govern these capabilities, because of their very nature, we first must figure out how to integrate and deploy them inside of our organizations. And because highly autonomous agents are not like other more traditional AI systems, if we can use that word for a field that is still so new and advancing so rapidly, these look, again, more like colleagues. And so one of the things that we're doing at Leidos is really rethinking how org design looks and works. And so speaking of AI Governance 2.0, we are both designing what some of those tools, tradecraft, and methodology look like for the age of agents, and redesigning our AI governance team itself with agents. And I'll start on that side of the equation. So on my whiteboard at work, I have a line down the middle, and on one side of the line, the left-hand side, I have sort of 5 classic roles that you'd imagine an AI governance team would have. We have folks focused on AI policy, AI risk, folks that are just simply leading the operations of the team, et cetera. And so that is FTE, full-time equivalent human workers. On the right-hand side, though, we have FAE, full-time agent equivalent workers. And we've literally drawn it this way because our hypothesis is we are going to go into these new org design scenarios needing to think about, again, this hybrid workforce. And so we have mapped between the left side and the right side of the responsibilities for the sort of classic canonical human type roles in work, which of those responsibilities can agents augment and help with, and which of those responsibilities can we hand off to agents in their entirety. And our contention is only by thinking about this team in this holistic human machine way, can we actually design who is doing what appropriately. And only then can we start to understand what sort of governance controls and capabilities do we need to wrap around this whole apparatus such that we understand in this broader orchestration of humans and machines, who's doing what, who needs what permissions, how do we even think about what data access rights look like for humans versus machines in the scenario? Do they simply mirror us? Should they have a whole different framework guiding that? And so I think starting with how you're going to integrate this new phenomenon into your organization. Again, these things are basically digital colleagues, They're not software or static tools that you use in a chatbot like way. These are things you can give goals and have them execute autonomously. And so that requires a different design. And of course, that, as you can imagine, ask a whole bunch of questions about different ways that we need to think about governance.
The New York City Bar Association is a dynamic community of over 23,000 legal practitioners. Members shape the future of the legal profession, serve the public, and gain an edge in their careers. To learn more about becoming a member of the City Bar or to join today, visit nycbar.org/join. Save 20% on semi-annual dues when you join. Call Customer Relations at 212-382-6663 and use code POD24.
Wow. I think that's a great way to think about it, Jeff, and very sophisticated. And I hope that resonates with the audience, particularly folks at companies, because I don't think a lot of thinking has even progressed that far. I'm curious, and maybe I can bring Ramsey into this part of the conversation, and you too, Marcia, since you mentioned human rights. So one thing we talked about earlier was, I talked about this yesterday with the military leaders, is just because you can do it, should you do it, right? And I think I'm getting a lot of feedback just out there in the ecosystem, talking to different companies and doing presentations and what have you. And there's this, we are in the FOMO acceleration mode. We innovate at all costs. It's the existential event. So if we don't do it, we'll go extinct and our competitors will outpace us. So we're just going to deploy. It's just going to happen. And somebody else can deal with the risk, right? Somebody else can deal with the should we do it question, because if our firm doesn't exist anymore, then it doesn't matter. And if we do still exist, in the next management team or somebody else can deal with this. And so I don't know, Ramsey, maybe you have some thoughts here, because your technology is actually deploying these agents, right?
I think the best lens to use on this is that if there's like a fundamental evil trapped in the human condition in some sort of normative way, it may fundamentally be that like our being kicked out of Eden was really just being doomed to never adequately coordinate. And it is in fact coordination failure that is like, that was the apple that got eaten, in the sense of from individual people to groups of people to organizations or policymaking bodies to nations with one another at almost every scale, within the scale and between the scales and between organizations at the same scale. Coordination is nightmarishly hard to get everybody on the same page of, so here's what I mean and what I'm talking about. Here's what the words I'm using mean. Here's my intention set. Here's my incentive set. And then here's the actions I'm going to go take by the natural arrangement of all those things. And to do so in ways that are larger than two or three people, or maybe one firm to another, or one nation to another, appears like dead impossible. And that might be like the fallen nature of our world. And I say all this because, again, I'm sitting in financial district of San Francisco. I'm within 20 blocks of the headquarters of every frontier model lab, where the management of these labs and the staff at these labs full well know and will go online and talk about how they're basically in a dead heat arms race to invent God. And that's it. They are not looking for a better calculator. They're not looking for a business transformation tool. They're trying to invent a new species, and a super intelligent, super powerful species. That is not in the footnotes. That is in the spoken out loud part. So if someone kind of spoke out loud, like, yeah, we think we're going to unleash God, but it's unclear if it's going to be one of those bad Old Testament gods or one of the cool new Old Testament or New Testament gods. And we're all like, oh, cool, tight. It can still write my emails though, right? Like that would, like, there's a gas leak in here. Something's like, there's a mismatch in our impotence here. So I do think that coordination is basically the thing that lies underneath all of it. But as someone who builds synthetic workers, could ostensibly be part of the problem here. So my company, Mission Control AI, Public Benefit Corporation, we recently we were incredibly proud and excited to welcome a guy named Jeff Ralston to our investment team. Jeff was the previous president of Y Combinator, the big Silicon Valley startup accelerator of fame. And he and his investment firm, not YC, but his own personal, have taken a big interest in AI safety. And I said, we need to start backing the teams that are going to make a difference on being able to deploy this technology or the technologies around it in ways that help prop up the best parts of the human condition and reduce the chances that we are going to lapse into really shitty futures, either through poorly aligned AI systems, poorly implemented, boring digital transformation versions of AI systems. Just do some things to improve the likelihood that this doesn't all turn into a place where we find ourselves in a world that's much worse than the one we have now. And he's taken this bet on us because in the core of how we've developed our synthetic workers lies a lot of care and attention paid to steerability and control and auditability and governance. And our contention is that the world's a better place if it is full of this type of work. Because to be clear, 11,400 people are going to retire today and tomorrow and the day after. And if we think that the government is getting any bigger or more competent in the next few years, at least at the federal level, we haven't been paying attention to what's going on. We're currently lapsing towards basic fundamental managed decline. And unless we start finding how to synthesize labor really fast, all of this comes unglued because the teams that create your power and ship your goods and fly your fighter jets are hemorrhaging people. And the only way we're going to get out of this by the current arrangement appears to be through. The only way out is through, and it's to synthesize work. If that's true, then having governance cooked into the tech itself that you propagate out there into the world is going to be a hell of a lot more effective and easier than trying to bolt on governance afterwards. So when we deploy synthetics, when we support legal teams that are grappling with great labor law and they've been sent a spreadsheet of hours of 100,000 rows and they got to go find that piece of hay in the needle stack to be able to make progress on a case, and they're used to paying $50,000 every time this does, and they can use a synthetic for a 90% cost reduction to do this, and now they're looking and saying, this is now a part of how we work. Is the world a better, safer place there if governance is cooked in from the start, or if it's bolted on through monitoring and checklist afterwards? And our contention is you put it in the core from the start, because that gets to a world that is full of this productive capacity and is easier to align with our virtues and our values. And that's been how, as an AI team, that's how we think about what the world should be like.
That's so insightful, Ramsey. I really appreciate that. And I hope your clients are resonating with that. I think that's the way I'm looking at the market as well. And I'd be curious as to Jeff and Marcia's reactions here, is that I think we've gotten into a little bit of this binary, maybe unnecessary tension or either or, right? A dualism, which is we either have innovation or we have governance. We either have speed or we have controls. They're inconsistent, so there's an unacceptable trade-off. You have to pick one or the other. And I fundamentally disagree with that. I think the power application here is the one that does blend the two, and actually where the governance and controls and fundamental management duties help the tech, help the company, help the enterprise achieve the benefits that it's looking for through a synthetic workforce. I guess I struggle with the idea that, the big defense company like I used to work for wouldn't build an airplane that wasn't tested and evaluated. Of course, they do that to the nth degree. They wouldn't put anything in the hands of a pilot they didn't have 100% confidence in. And that includes an awful lot of software and technology. You wouldn't just deploy something, hope for the best, and see what happens. Jeff, I don't know if you have anything to add here, and then I'm going to shift a little bit to a question for Marcia.
Yeah, I think one thing that maybe connect the two dots between what Ramsey was just saying and what we were talking about earlier in terms of designing these more hybrid teams and workforces so that we can understand what the right sort of governance controls need to be for this new age is the fact that I think AI governance 2.0, at least for the next few years, looks less like model cards, data cards, guardrails, et cetera. And it looks more like a series of very weird questions. And I'll give you two examples. The first one is, and this was inspired by one of our conversations, Carl, is say we've integrated our synthetic workers into our team, and they're getting really good at understanding our work, assisting our work, and in some cases, frankly, taking over a majority of the jobs on our team itself. Well, what happens when 80% of our synthetic colleagues on that team get good at basically 80% of our jobs? You can imagine a scenario in which a company that has slightly different values looks at that and goes, well, great, I don't need my very expensive human workers anymore. I now have trained basically, as you said earlier, their digital twin. Let me just get rid of the human workers and lean all the way in to agents. What does employment law mean in that context? What sort of protections does it offer or not to those human workers in this fundamentally novel scenario? So I think that's one example of an AI governance 2.0 question. Another example is, and Ramsey mentioned this in his earlier remarks, we call agent because we're giving them agency on our behalf to take actions, to make decisions, to achieve outcomes for us out in the world, et cetera, et cetera. So if we give an agent agency, and it goes out in the world and it takes a bunch of actions in representation of us, and it does something really embarrassing that has a significant non-trivial impact on our social capital, who is held responsible for that? How do we recover our social capital, even if we can point very clearly that, oh, my synthetic worker made a horrendous mistake in that decision it made in trying to achieve this very normal outcome. Perhaps it was engaging on social media on my behalf to support a new research paper I published, but it made a really ludicrous claim, or it was very insensitive to replying to some comments on that post. Now, because it's representing me, I look very different out in the world and my social capital has taken a hit. How do I think about recovering that social capital? Do I now, quote unquote, fire that agent on my behalf? Do I reprimand it in some way? Again, these are fundamentally weird questions, but they are questions that we're going to have to contend with in short order. And so again, as we think about what AI governance 2.0 looks like, yes, we'll have some more quote unquote traditional technical controls that may carry over from the 1.0 world that we've been living in for the past 3-5 years. But we're also going to be presented with these really highly novel situations where agents are doing stuff with and for us that really challenge how we think about a guardrail, that really think about the balance between control and autonomy in the service of achieving efficiency, outcomes, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeff. I mean, and you've teed up. Thank you for teeing up the pivot to the whatabouts and the what ifs, right? Because here's Marcia, here's where you can jump in. There are just so many issues. If you actually start to think through this, second order consequences of truly implementing a synthetic workforce that is augmenting human workers, or in fact replacing them altogether, or let's be really real about this, the synthetic workers are teaming with each other and they're virtual teams, either one-on-one or as groups, and everything you can think of humans is now being done by agents that are coded, executing the standard operating procedures and proceeding, and with outputs that are not 100% absolutely predictable. This is one of the features of agents being trained on data sets, et cetera. So how do we even begin to think about these scenarios with the hybrid workforce and human machine teaming? I mean, as a former chief compliance officer, I've had a couple of ideas pop up right away, which is the agent has appeared on a Zoom call or a Teams call, and there's a dialogue going on amongst the team. And as Jeff just said, the agent makes some comment or responds to a question in a way that's viewed by another participant on the call as insensitive or even discriminatory. And as a compliance officer, I think you should absolutely you have to expect and be prepared for, as a management team, to get that complaint, maybe not just one, but many, that the agents have done this or the agent have done that. And I have an issue and I have a complaint and I want you to do something about it. You just turn it off? And then what's the consequence management? They're assumed that there was an inappropriate comment. Who's responsible for that? Obviously, there was the company that is either acquired, procured from a vendor, or deployed the agent capacity. And then what does an appropriate action look like, a corrective action look like in that context? It's not a human being that you can say was like, we trained, Charlie did the wrong thing, we've now fired Charlie, right? It's not that kind of scenario altogether. On the flip side, I can also see scenarios where the agent itself has been coded to be very compliant and rule following, and in fact may conclude that the law has been violated in a certain situation. Let's say, for example, you're on a call about financial planning, and an agent that's deployed in the finance organization has determined that the discussion is around improperly booking a transaction in the quarter. And based on its coding, it's like that transaction should not be booked in the quarter. Should you not take revenue recognition for that? And as a result, the agents proactively send a hotline complaint that there's been a violation of internal policy, if not the general accepted accounting principles or SEC requirements. The more nightmare scenario from a compliance officer perspective, but not necessarily out of bounds, is if the agent had external email access. The agent, unless you've coded it to prohibit this, could in fact send an email to an external party, the government or what have you. And we haven't even gone into the fact that agents could collude with each other between companies or do all sorts of things if they have external authorization. I mean, actually, the number of scenarios you come up just seem to proliferate the longer you think about it. But I'll turn it over to you, Marcia, and see if you can give us some framing here, because I know you've been thinking about these issues and talking to tech companies as well.
So I think let's go back to the agent as the whistleblower, right? And we all know that regular human beings really think about calling a hotline. It's something, no matter what they say, someone's going to get me. May not be today, but they're going to be lurking in the shadows to get me when I least expect it. So why would I take this risk? The agent, not being human, likely doesn't have those human concerns. And if you've got a company that does not have a well-functioning compliance program, and your training basically says you can skip all the chain of commands if it's not working, then that may likely happen. AIs are not human, but human resources is increasingly being taken over by AI at exactly the time that human resources could be the most useful, because where you're going to see so much of the liability is on some of these employment issues. So when we're talking about deployment, I think one thing that companies have to think about, and that the lawyers should be advising their companies, is, yes, we've got the governance and governance 2.0. For example, in a public company, you're going to have a financial expert on your audit committee. Perhaps you need an AI expert. And what does that AI expert look like? You may need an AI expert on your board. And that's something I think that, not that we want to push more regulation down people's throats, but it is something that I think will be useful, because the huge information asymmetry between AI vendors and companies is such that companies could be told anything. Not everybody's going to be like Ramsey and be thinking about ethics. I think a lot of companies put in what I've been calling optical ethics by design. They put something in that looks good, right? We've got privacy by design. We've got all these different kinds of things. It looks good, but it doesn't really stand the test of time because nobody's really interrogating it to see if it works. When you're thinking about some of these employment law issues, what happens if the agents get unhappy and decide they want to organize? Can they? The agents don't need any kind of sleep. They don't need overtime. But are they entitled to certain kinds of rights? And you have people right now thinking about these issues, because AI in the employment context has already been in the courts. You've got the Workday versus Mobley case. You've got Amazon, where there have been allegations of screening for certain kinds of things. So Mobley was an age discrimination case. There's like a collective action, which is like a class action for the non-lawyers. That's already been certified with 40 workforce people that have been rejected because of Workday's AI screening. And the courts have been really clear that the vendor is responsible as well as the company. You can't just blame, well, the vendor did it, the company is also going to be responsible. Harper versus SiriusXM, race discrimination in Title VII. A plaintiff was rejected 149 out of 150 times despite the qualifications, because the AI allegedly was using proxies for race, like zip codes in schools. These are the things that were already concerns about algorithmic biases. And as they say, of course, garbage in with garbage out. But who is going to be training what's happening there? And this looks at things like disparate treatment and disparate impact. It's hard, because let's think about the legal recourse. The Trump administration has said they don't really believe that disparate impact should be a potential cause of action. By disparate impact, it means it didn't matter what your intent was. If the impact on the employees, on people applying for jobs is harmful, that's also going to be a cognizable cause of action. The Trump administration said not so fast. California is saying intent doesn't matter. So you've got a patchwork of state laws, just like in the privacy arena, right? Nothing that's particularly sector specific. If I was advising a company today, I'd say you need an AI governance framework that not only just has silos of people looking at, are we looking at the NIST framework? Are we looking at this? Are we looking at that? But the remaining HR people that work at your company should be there. Your risk people, your corporate communications people, your internal and external audit, some operations people so that you really think about it in a holistic way. As we know, most companies tend to silo some of these decision-making things, and think about where can AI really help us, and how do we decide what risks we want to accept, mitigate, transfer, or reject. And that also goes, as we're thinking about risk, what do our contracts look like? Right? If you're a company and you've got EPLI, Employment Practice Liability Insurance, is already restrictive. Will it cover anything related to AI and agents? I think the insurance companies and insurance carriers can really play a role in making sure that companies really look at risk a different way, because we all know what gets measured gets treasured. What insurance will pay and won't pay for is something that people are going to pay attention to. And that may be where we get to the boards and get to those kind of risk issues. And then finally, I want to thinking about looking at your contracts. And for the lawyers out there, like, I don't know anything about AI, but I know contracts. This part is for you, right? Think about the indemnification clauses. Think about force majeure. What is within and without the company's control, right? What are known risks? We know the potential kinds of risks with AI and synthetic workers. How do you contract around that? What kind of audit rights and strong indemnities do you want to have? So it might evolve like kind of like the CIRA policies did when we started having all those breaches. But these are all things to think about. So I am, by the way, all for lots of synthetic workers. But I also know, as human beings, we know how difficult it is to manage a human being that is smarter than we are. We have egos. We don't know enough. They can tell us anything. So we have to be thinking about, how do we manage these synthetic workers? At some point, they're going to be colleagues. At some point, they're going to be our bosses. But when these synthetic employees are our, quote, employees, how do you manage that? Not just how do you discipline it, but how do you manage an entity that will eventually be much smarter at you and everything? And then what happens if you yourself are managed by that synthetic worker? At some point, you're training your replacement. That person, that agent now supervises you. What's the recourse you have there? So these are all areas that companies and regulators need to be thinking about, and not in the future. We've got to think about it now.
Yeah, that's tremendous framing, Marcia. And I think what's really resonating with me is that it's not about waiting for some regulator or external force to sort of tell you what to do. You need to deal with it now. And frankly, there are structures and requirements and obligations within an existing organization that need to be addressed as you deploy this technology, like you would any other manager challenge. And I think that's where we need to really have folks engage and recognize the challenges. I think the point about the contracts is excellent. I've made this point many a time. It's, you don't need a law, you don't need a regulation. You have an arm's length contract. You have acquired the AI. You have representations and warranties. You have indemnity provisions. You have intellectual property provisions. You have liability limits. You have all the issues that you would deal with in a normal transaction. And in fact, they are more consequential when you're acquiring this technology. You should be asking a lot of questions about the data and the training data, et cetera. I think another point that you touched on that I want to jump up and down on is auditing, right? Supervision, monitoring, and auditing. I think that's an area where we're going to need to see accelerated activity. Publicly traded companies here in the United States, they at least if you look at the Fortune 100, they have general auditors and large and well-staffed and resourced audit teams that have to go out and test policies, procedures, and controls, render an opinion on whether management has actually fulfilled their obligations, and issue a report that usually scores it against some sort of metric, kind of a stoplight, yellow, green, or red, and then report up to an audit committee that the risk is being handled. I don't think AI gets an exception to that. I don't think you can step aside and say, because it's AI, I don't have to audit it. In fact, I think it's even more important than ever to be auditing how, for example, synthetic workers are being rolled out in a company and what the guardrails and controls and governance are around that. Because I think, to loop back to your point, I don't think it's really going to be a sustainable position for a company to take a position like Air Canada tried to do in that now somewhat dated example, but still valid example, where, and it wasn't even an agent, it was just a bot, but where an artificial entity made a representation or a commitment on a ticket price, and the company tried to disclaim it saying, well, it wasn't us, it was just our math. And the judge is like, it's your math, it made a mistake, it's your problem. And I think we'll continue to see that. So we have a few minutes left here on this podcast, and I kind of just wanted to go around the virtual room here and ask for your thoughts and I think we've touched upon these, but maybe a little bit of a summation and a couple of tips for our audience who's thinking like, what the heck am I supposed to do about this? What is a logical next step for me if I'm a lawyer in a company, or if I'm like a technologist in a company or in a control function in a company? How should I be thinking about this? How should I be thinking of my boss? And what are like one or two like practical steps you could take now to help address some of the issues that we've talked about? And since on my screen, you're directly to my right, Jeff, I will start with you.
That sounds good. I would say, and first of all, I just appreciate this conversation. We've covered an unbelievable amount of ground here, which I think is representative of the nature of this topic in where we are in its maturity and how it's starting to really challenge organizations to think differently. And so my first sort of pro tip would be basically just that. I have a framework, which I talk to Ramsey about all the time. I call practical, tangible, and useful. And so as these topics, the concept of synthetic workers feels big and craftable, again, fantastical. The more you can think about this in ways that are practical, tangible, and useful for your organization, how you want to and need to start integrating this technology into your workflows and processes now, the more easy it will be to wrap your hands around the issues and the big questions that are most relevant for you. And then the second thing, which is related, is I would say if it feels weird and abnormal, that means you're probably starting to ask the right questions. And because this stuff is weird and abnormal. 2 years ago, no one would have thought that we'd have sufficiently advanced agentic AI capabilities such that we'd be talking about introducing them into our workforce as digital colleagues. But that's where we are. And so the weirder the question that you can imagine, that means you're probably in the right place to start working through what you're going to do about it. And so to sum both those things up, be weird, but also balance that with practical, tangible, and useful frameworks and simply ways of approaching these problems.
Rams?
So I'm going to lovingly push back on just one facet of what Jeff said, because in 2021, we sat down at the behest of Schmidt Futures and wrote a 45-page white paper on synthetic labor in 2021. And our only problem was that we said, but the date that would happen would be 2027 instead of 25. And so I won't say no one was thinking about it. We were definitely thinking about it. The problem was in 2022, when we went out to the venture market talking about, you're going to have this colleague and it's going to be made of AI. This was pre-chat GPT. And so investors looked at us like we were smoking meth. Will you just go back to making B2B SaaS, man? Like, that's never happening. And then you fast forward to today. And I think the thing that like strikes me of all of this is, and admittedly, Marcia, it's the things you've described. It is how absolutely in line with a lot of the things we already know how to think about some of these concerns are. So at no point today has anyone said anything that is that outrageously far-fetched. And that's the most striking thing. The most striking thing is that everything we've discussed is straight down the fairway. That's wild, because we're talking about disembodied, non-corporeal, like totally synthesized out of thin air, full-blown colleagues at work, and then the obvious legal ramifications of such. And we're not talking about this sitting around with our funny sci-fi friends, imagining what's going to go in our next book, and we have to contend with just how deep into the future we all actually are. And I think a lot of folks, again, are going to say, nope, I'm pretending I didn't hear this episode and I don't have to add this to my list of things I'm going to have a tummy ache about today. But the practical reality of the matter is that this is now where we live and what we've got to deal with. And there's a set of very strong incentive structures that got us here and will keep pulling us forward. And what I would offer to folks is that the things that seem slightly outside of the Overton window today, of that acceptable conversation that you can have with your most otherwise just right down the middle, straight and narrow kinds of colleagues, the things that feel slightly outside the Overton window today are about to come screaming into the Overton window tomorrow. So if you would like to have any sense of preparedness about the world as it's about to exist, anything you can do to learn more about what's going on here in this space, Not at the, oh yeah, no, like it wrote my emails for me, but like, no, you need to kind of take that next step of, okay, so where's it going? What's the thing that's going to happen? You think it's going to stop at writing your emails? No, it's absolutely going to become an integral part of your team, the teams you have to work with, and the teams you end up representing or defending. This is where we're going. And the fact that Carl, you get to assemble us today to do something like this, to me, is the like indicator that even for myself, things are actually happening much faster than I expected.
Thanks for that, Ramsey. Marcia as well.
Well, things are happening faster, but we're talking to an audience of lawyers who like things to go slowly. And I think this is the real problem, right? Lawyers, by definition, are risk averse. They want to see how everything has turned out someplace else. And for my lawyer friends, that is a disservice to our clients. So even if your firm still is not using AI, you're still thinking about things like hallucinations and ethical rules, all of which are important, you really have to realize that the rest of the world is moving forward. So some kind of very pointed recommendations I would be thinking about, just like we have, if you've never had the pleasure of doing a review of everything for a document retention policy, where you have to figure out where every single document is and who has access to it and why, do the same thing for artificial intelligence. How is it work? Where is it being used? Where are the shadow users who say that they're not using it, but they're actually on ChatGPT all day long? Where is it touching employment decisions, risk decisions, et cetera? You have to create an inventory. Update your vendor contracts. Think about the indemnities, bias audit obligations, cooperation clauses. Engage insurance earlier. You should be talking to your insurance brokers, talking to the board. You need to be looking at where coverage does exist and does not exist for every aspect of where artificial intelligence is used in the business, forming some multi-stakeholder committees, HR, IT, legal, risk, compliance, et cetera, to report not just to the board, and this should be a regular quarterly agenda item for boards now, not just a once a year AI thing, because as the models change frequently, more than we can keep track of. And then also you got to prepare for the state patchwork, the New York City, California, Colorado, Texas, Illinois. How do you comply and what risks do you take? Just like in privacy, like if you're used to that, do we go with the California model or do you go with such and such model because it's the most restrictive? But that may not make good business sense. So instead of companies focusing on should we or shouldn't we, it's here. What do we do about it? And how do we make sure we get ourselves educated, work with people like Jeff and Ramsey and Carl and others who are thinking through these in not just in the vendor way of put this in and skyrocket your productivity by 85% in 30 days. Those are the quick hit, exciting things, but to really deploy properly and to be sustainable as a business, you've got to do it the right way and ask these hard questions and get the experts in that can help you answer them.
Great. All right. Well, that was awesome from my perspective, and I really appreciate everybody's input. I hope all of you out there listening to this podcast take away a few nuggets of value and stay tuned to this space as we continue to talk about future developments, particularly through the New York City Bar Association's leadership in all things AI. And with that, we wish you a good day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar. If you enjoy this podcast, please like and subscribe wherever you listen. Find more City Bar podcasts on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, iHeart, or at our website at www.nycbar.org/podcasts. Be sure to check out This Lawyer's Life, a professional development podcast where we talk with lawyers about seizing opportunities, learning lessons the hard way, and about what makes them tick. And don't miss Building Belonging, a podcast that embraces authentic conversations about DEIB solutions by amplifying the most marginalized voices in the legal industry and exploring spaces others dare not. This podcast was produced and edited by Eli Cohen and Jalen Martin.